primaries are not run in any standardized way, or at least in the Republican Party, not in a standardized way across this country. Explain how they are run, explain who sets the rules, and how are they like a barrier or not in terms of like smaller candidates, third-party candidates, whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, so the easiest answer is it depends, which is a problem in general. But like Iowa, which obviously, happened last week, as you were talking about earlier, is the best example of that. So Iowa, up until this year, was the first primary, or in this case, a caucus, for both parties. And the Democratic Party for a long time has been saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. Because when you talk about barriers to voting, and as Democrats, we should be doing everything we can to get rid of those. The Iowa caucus has some of the biggest barriers to voting there are. You have to go in the evening, sometimes to someone's house, sometimes to like a VFW hall. You have to go to some different place. You have to stand in a room with a whole bunch of people who are your neighbors you may or may not know. And then you publicly have to talk about who you're supporting and actually stand in groups in the room. They do it differently in different places. But the point is, if we're trying to make it easier, we're trying to improve participation. Caucuses like that actually diminish it. And then there's the other issue and concern that Iowa is one of the whitest states in the country. And
Right.
So when we're talking about representing the Democratic Party and selecting a candidate who is a representative of the diversity of the party, the idea that you start with Iowa and New Hampshire has generally been problematic. So the Democratic Party, they have some influence, and this is on both sides, both parties, the DNC, the RNC have some influence. And the biggest influence they have is they can say, basically, y'all can do whatever you want in the states. You can vote however you want. But in the end, we're going to decide who our nominee is at the convention. The conventions have been basically pageants for like 40 years now. They haven't been anything more than formalities. But in reality, and we saw this with the superdelegates going back a ways and the controversies around that, that's where the candidates are actually nominated. So you have this push and pull. But when I say it depends, some states say we're going to do caucuses, we're going to do the Iowa thing. Most states do primaries. The primaries are run by the states, by the actual official government, Secretary of State, Department of Elections, but they look to the parties to say, just tell us who's on the ballot.
Right.
And that's where some of this controversy we're seeing, because in both the Republican and the Democratic primary, you've seen a handful of states who have just said, Joe Biden's the only one on the ballot, except New Hampshire, where Joe Biden isn't on the ballot.
He's not even on the ballot. In fact, they're doing a write-in campaign where they're like, okay, we'll write him. But it's assumed that all the delegates will just throw. Obviously, they are going to be going for Joe Biden and no other. Marriane Williamson is running.
At this point, what the DNC is saying is that the vote won't result in any delegates. They're not going to seat the delegates. So they're saying you can vote, but this doesn't matter what you're doing. Whoever you could, if Marriane Williamson won 100% of the vote, doesn't matter. We're not seating your delegates at the convention. They won't.
Now, here's the thing. That's wild to me. The problem I'm having is I'm not upset enough because I don't like Marriane Williamson enough, and I don't like Dean Phillips enough to be upset about it. But ostensibly, if there was someone who I did like in the race, like, I don't know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or another progressive, Jamal Bowman, I think, was at one point talking about this. We talked about that with Ryan Grimm not so long ago. Like, I'd be upset. I'd be incensed that it was just automatically given, oh, Biden's an incumbent. It's a shoo-in. It's going to be this way no matter what. You can't do anything about it. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, what I would say is there was an opportunity there, and this will make me unpopular, but there was an opportunity there, meaning the DNC a long time ago, they voted and they said, look, we need to move Iowa, New Hampshire back. We need to move South Carolina and Nevada up, because those are states that are more representative of the diversity of the Democratic Party. Let's move them up. And so they said, Iowa, New Hampshire, you can go after, but you can't be first. And so New Hampshire said, no, we're going to go first. And so
they just disobey. I mean, that's so funny that like they just did it today. They're doing it today. Iowa did it already. Although I guess the caucus, it's very confusing because
there was no Democratic caucus. Iowa just kind of stood down. New Hampshire didn't. But in the end, like New Hampshire, they could have had an election where their votes counted and the delegates were seated. So it wasn't, I understand why people look at it and they say, well, it's the big bad Democratic Party going in and telling us who the nominee is going to be. And in this case, I don't question, Joe Biden as president, as the Democratic president, is the effective head of the Democratic Party.
Right.
And so that creates some conflicts, and it creates situations where people look at it and say, well, this isn't fair. And I get that. But in the end, this case, like New Hampshire, they could have just listened to what they asked them to do, gone a few weeks later, and their votes would have counted, like South Carolina and Nevada and every other.
Interesting.
Well, most
so
other
it was
states.
because they were demoting them from going first or second that they could have had maybe a more robust primary. But the states, I mean, I know in New Hampshire, I went to New Hampshire 4 years. Oh God, it was not 4 years ago. It was 2016, but it feels like yesterday. And you're just like, there's so much pride in them going first. They're so into it. It's like covered bridges,
They love it.
white people, and going first in the primary. That's all
That's
it is.
That's it. Live free or die. They their state motto, for those. I'm not just making that up.
Yes.
But it is a matter of pride. And like, to their credit, and again, this shows just how sort of stupid the whole nominating process is within both parties. So say New Hampshire decided they were going to go later when the DNC asked them to go, but the Republican Party didn't want to change it because they're perfectly fine with having one of the whitest states in the country go first, because what difference does it make? That's who's voting in their primaries. Well, then in New Hampshire, what do? Do we have two primaries now, which actually becomes very expensive, becomes confusing for voters? There are problems, and it shows how this primary system in our country, not surprisingly, is flawed.
Completely flawed. And sorry, just to stay on this for a little bit, I feel like both after 2016 and after 2020, especially 2020, I think what sort of rang out was like, why do we do primaries so piecemeal and at different times? Why is this the longest election cycle? Why don't we all vote on the same day, every single state, and we vote in the same way? Dunzo. Like, obviously we tabulate it, takes a while. But who does it benefit that the primaries are so spaced out?
Well, the argument for having it the way it is, or at least roughly the way it is, where it's spaced out, and the argument for Iowa and New Hampshire originally was you want to make room for candidates who don't come in with the institutional advantages. Maybe they don't have all the money, and they can come in these small states where it's less expensive to campaign, and you can go in and you can live there for a year. Basically, you can do.
Right. There's not like an $8 smoothie anywhere, or like a $16 smoothie, more like.
Until you get closer to Massachusetts and New Hampshire, then you might run into that. But, and some would argue that's how President Obama was able to win eventually, is because he came through, he surprised people, by winning in Iowa.
You get momentum. Sorry to interrupt you. So it's almost like, because for me, I'm like, well, wouldn't the person who's got the most money be able to withstand the number of states? But it's like, no, you can see, and great example. I remember him, Barack Obama, being able to have this momentum. It was not originally at his back, but how did he do in the first two? Did he win Iowa?
Yeah, I believe, and this is this. I'm going to embarrass myself. My recollection is he won Iowa. I don't recall in New Hampshire, because I've blocked most of that from memory, because it was an awful primary. But and to be clear, a great result. But in terms of the Clinton-Obama dynamic, it was just a brutal primary.
Yeah.
And to be fair, it wasn't like he was an unknown candidate. He was, he set the world on fire when he spoke at the 2004 Democratic Convention. Remember, when we're nominating John Kerry, and then Senator Obama gets up and speaks, and everyone's like, why can't this guy be our nominee?
This guy is awake.
Right.
John Kerry. Well, I mean, I'm asleep. Look, Kerry, he has his own legacy. I liked him so much when he lost, actually. I think it was a blessing that he lost. I mean, 4 more years of Bush. But finally, sorry, this is so like wonky and in the weeds, but like the convention, the idea that there's been talk of like, what if Biden pulls an LBJ and he decides to step out of the race and not at the convention and whatnot, and doesn't run. But the way the conventions are is, like you said, it's much more of a shoe-in. It's not as contentious as it used to be. I think the most contention I think we saw maybe was 2016 with Hillary and Bernie, where it was like you heard just like opposite chants, like Hillary, Bernie, Hillary, and that was like exciting. But other than that, it's just been a rubber stamp.
Yeah, and so you're right to bring this up because there are a lot of people I think who are looking at this, and there's some amount of like fan fiction out there, which is like,
So much fan
here's the
fiction.
mechanism by which Joe Biden he's going to be the nominee, right? I mean, uh, he's going to be the nominee. Yes, like if you want to go to the convention, in the end, both parties at their conventions can decide by their own rules who they are nominating.
Mhm.
And then they tell each state, this is our nominee, this is who you put on the ballots, right? So they have the right to do that, but there are some laws around what they can actually do, and there are the bylaws of the party. And like you mentioned, the Bernie Hillary thing was just like a little sample of that, where the super delegates could vote for whom they wanted, but most of
Right.
them are bound to vote for the candidate who won the state's nominating process,
Right, right,
primary,
right.
caucus, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's
I
it's
just, personally, I've been very silent. Tom, you seem like a very lovely man. One of the things
he's
that
not.
bothers me about being a Democrat, especially as a person of color, is this conversation is, there's a lot of lightness, a lot of joking, but it is very severe. No matter who becomes president, whiteness is not going to be hanging in the balance, Democratic or Republican. And people of color are not going to have the same advantages. When Trump was president, it was a very scary time. Hate crimes were running through the roof. Police brutality towards Black people was excessive, more than it's ever been. And he trumpeted people together who already were silently being racist and letting them out loud be racist. And one of my biggest problems with the Democratic Party is that it's a lot of passivity that is happening. And as we sit here and we listen to what's supposed to happen and the rules and the regulations, it seems like the Democratic Party is always following the rules and regulations, and the Republicans aren't. They're doing whatever they want. They're having closed meetings. They're pulling people out of offices. They're, when we were talking about Atlanta, and we had those two Black congresswomen who were arrested, I believe they were congresswomen, because they were trying to stop these things that were happening, and they were forcefully removed from a position, that they own or they had won. I'd rather speak about what we're going to do to be stronger when fighting against an enemy that will do anything, and not this sort of like turn the other cheek. We're going to be the best people we can be because it's not working.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I mean, and we certainly have a long history of this of Democrats. I mean, going back to Merrick Garland, when Republicans just said, no, President Obama, you don't get to appoint a Supreme Court justice, for a year. And there were opportunities there where Democrats could have, at least many believe, certainly what Republicans would have done, made a recess appointment, say, sorry. We've talked about expanding the Supreme Court, things we could do to, from the Dobbs decision, overturning Roe v. Wade, that there are opportunities there. The filibuster and looking at Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, two Democrats standing in the way of all the things that could be done in the name of justice and equality, which is obviously the opposite of what the Republicans are doing. But you're right, adopting their tactics in some ways, at a minimum, just to undo a minimal amount of the damage they've done. It's incredibly frustrating that that's not really part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the filibuster is a great example. I agree with you.
I don't mean to cut you off, because I'm really interested. So how can we get that into the conversation? As somebody who's a Democrat and by default and feels not represented, but still will vote Democrat, how do I get into that conversation to start affecting some type of changes?
Yeah, it's such a sea change, holistic change in terms of the party. I think, to your point, there has been such minimal support for those things. How do you change Joe Manchin? How do you change Kyrsten Sinema? You beat them. I mean, they're both going to be gone from the Senate after this year, so there's that element. Kyrsten Sinema, Kyrsten Sinema,
we shall see, but
we'll
gone.
See.
I mean, they're both going to have cushy lobbying. I mean, I would just say, and this is what sucks about it, Yamanika, because I agree with you, and I feel like it's easy to feel just disaffected because like no one's actually tackling the issues, where they're all playing safe by the rules, or they can't amend the rules in order to actually get an equal playing field, pass voter rights legislation, pass labor, union rights legislation, the PRO Act and whatnot. But it's like they want folks to tune out. And I think that Tom's right that it's like, you got to beat them. We have to beat them. And what sucks is the candidates we've been given are weak sauce, in large part. And that's why you see also the squad, like progressives, I think, in Congress growing their ranks, because people like straight talkers. They like people who stand up for the working class. They're mostly all people of color. They like when folks defend immigrant rights. They stand, they like when Cory Bush holds a sleep out and says no, people should not be evicted. I'm going to take a massive action on this. But then we're left with the Joe Bidens, and we're constantly told that no, he's the safe guy. You can't be too crazy. You got to be safe. You got to play it safe. Well, Mr. Safe just co-signed a massive genocide, and that's ongoing in Gaza. So I don't think Joe Biden's looking very safe in November either, in my opinion.
I mean, even the way he's spoken about people of color. For me, it gets harder and harder every year to convince people, especially people of color, to vote. And not only just to vote now, to vote Democrat, because it's like there's so many people I know who are friends of mine who are saying Republican is the best way to go, and Republicans see it. And I'm just like, what in the Twilight Zone is happening here? But I don't have any counter arguments because what can I say?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it's like the moving goalposts. I think that I've heard a lot of people frustrated with, that I understand why, but we're not doing a great job communicating this. Meaning, we told everyone in 2022 the importance of holding on to the Senate for Democrats and how difficult it would be. And people worked very hard. Activist organizers worked very hard to actually make that happen. Against all odds, hold on to the Senate. And then we hold on to the Senate, and then people look at it and say, well, okay, but now what? And, the reality is it is important that Democrats control the Senate, from appointing judges and that sort of thing. That's so behind the scenes. And when the excuse is, well, yeah, but you still got these two senators who are holding everything up, I think people are understandably frustrated, saying, well, you moved the goalposts on us. We did what you said we had to do, and it's still not enough.
Bank fees. Biden's trying to get rid of overdraft fees from banks. That's huge. But again, it's like all that shit gets caught up in courts, and there's so many people.
Well, same with student loans, right? Like he just the other day announced another batch of student loan forgiveness, and he's actually done a lot of great things on this front. But it doesn't get through. And when a lot of the things we're talking about are like actual existential threats, it's understandable that not everything is gonna get through.
But it doesn't even look like Francesca, I'm so sorry, because this conversation, and you are the head bitch in charge. This is your show. But I think the biggest problem is also the age. Some of these things we could tolerate if it's like, is he going to make it through the next 4 years if he's there?
I mean, I feel like maybe it's the only way Kamala gets elected. So that's fine with me.
That's also the fear, right? Let's be real about the racism in this country. Nobody wants to see a woman of color run this. They didn't even want to see Hillary, and she as white as they can get. Yeah. So now you have a president who's on shaky ground. That's the narrative that Trump keeps running, even though he seems to be like 6 months younger than him. And we also seeing Biden making a lot of missteps mentally and all kinds of stuff, falling off bikes, falling upstairs, talking to the curtain at dinner parties. So, if he don't make it through 4 years, and then everybody goes, well, we about to have this woman of color, that's also another fear that we have going on that we're not fighting against.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.